These are not speakers. These are big wooden boxes of lies, or maybe particle board boxes of lies would be more appropriate. It's a pair of Panasonic Thrusters model SB380, and despite what the name implies, they will not take you to the stratosphere, and I make no allusion to there being anything more than lo-fi cheapos. However, there is something interesting about these which I realized only after I brought them home, so we're going to talk about it. I can see you all looking at me like I'm nuts. Why did I buy these? What could I possibly have to say about old cheapo speakers? To start with, I'm impulsive. But the thing is, I did in fact get these for a reason, and I'd like to make a case for anyone getting into collecting or dealing with old secondhand stereo equipment that having a pair of speakers like this is actually a pretty useful idea. Let me introduce Exhibit A, a Pioneer SX1010 that was sitting in a garage at a recent estate sale. It didn't cost very much, but it was a gamble to buy it since the only thing we can do to test it before spending the money is plug it in and see if the face lights up. Fortunately, it did and all the lights work, but whether it actually produced sound was another matter entirely. Spoiler, it doesn't. Well, it does sometimes, but it needs a complete rebuild with new relays and transistors and caps and adjustments and you name it. But the point is, without a scope and proper lab equipment, you have no real way of knowing whether it works without just powering it on and hooking it to speakers. For context, the only speakers I do have are the ones in my living room and a few from previous videos. I sold a bunch recently when we moved. Because of that, the last thing I want to do is hook a decent set that I restored or my good Martin Logans to an amp that I just pulled out of some guy's garage. That's why, for about 15 bucks, I decided to buy these, which will act as guinea pigs. I might eventually hook them to the wall in the studio like I did with the dim bulb tester, just so that they're up and out of the way, but that's future me's problem. Now, I thought that was going to be the end of the idea. I'd just use them to test equipment that I find, and there was nothing else to say. However, when I brought them home, I tried them out, I noticed something interesting. On first glance, and without reading the back, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is a three-way speaker system. After all, there are 3 speakers in there. 1, 2, 3, right? Lies. It's a 2-way speaker system. Let's take a closer look. So this is a pair of 2-way Panasonic SB380 thrusters, which means they're capable of both warp and impulse, which means they have 2 active speakers in the box, a 6.5-inch woofer and a 2.5-inch piezo tweeter. The third element on the bottom, which I've been facetiously calling a lie, is actually something called a passive radiator, and it is in fact meant to serve a purpose. When you think of a speaker, what comes to mind? It's usually a box with a couple of speaker cones on the front, right? Either some terminals on the back or occasionally a wire sticking out, usually some kind of mesh cover depending on what kind you have. But have you ever noticed a hole in some of the boxes? They show up everywhere from large floor speakers to small desktop computer speakers. Those are called base ports, and they usually have a pipe or tube attached to them on the inside. Without going into anything too technical, they essentially are there to allow the air in the box to resonate at certain lower frequencies and intensify the bass. This lets designers, among other things, enhance the frequency range or get more bass out of smaller drivers. This fake speaker-looking thing is called a passive radiator, and it serves the same purpose as a reflex tube. And it does it, in this case, with a little piece of cardboard which has been glued down under another piece of cardboard. In fact, most passive radiators are built to look like regular speakers. So, in the Thrusters' defense, I was being overly sensational, and they're not actually lies at all.
I don't believe you!
They're just cheap. Although, I do appreciate the superfluous screws. Now, usually, these things are tuned just like a bass port would be. They do that by either adjusting the mass of the radiator itself, changing the stiffness of the suspension, the diameter of the radiator, or a combination of all 3. However, a lot of the work is done by the enclosure itself, and the radiator or bass port is intended more as an augmentation. I'm also not 100% convinced that these have been tuned, despite what the label on the back may claim. But you never know.
You never know.
Passive radiators, as a concept, are a rabbit hole, albeit an interesting one. You can find countless discussions online about whether ports or radiators are better, and there are plenty of points to be made on both sides. But suffice to say, it's a very complicated argument, and it's one that doesn't really come up until you're actually designing, building, or modifying your own speaker enclosures. The guy behind the counter at the thrift store was unusually exuberant about these. He seemed familiar with the Thruster branding and was eager to tout how solid they were. I didn't see fit to argue with him because, as I've said on here countless times, if you like something, that's your prerogative. Nobody should tell you you're wrong for liking the way a set of speakers sounds, and every taste is equally valid. That said, I have no intention of replacing my Pioneers with these things. The cloth on the grills was a disaster when I bought them. I neglected to get photos, unfortunately, but they were filthy and both had about a grapefruit-sized stain on the top corner, which I spent an excessive amount of time cleaning. They soaked overnight in laundry detergent, and I spent at least an entire episode of Farscape scrubbing them with a small brush. I know they're cheap, but if I have to look at them every day, I'd rather they're clean. I also removed this big bundle of frayed speaker wire that was crudely spliced into them. But they came out pretty clean. These grills are also not removable. You'll note that I removed them anyway, but they were stapled on in 10 places. I actually used a paint can opener from Home Depot to get them off. This thing is a surprisingly useful little tool considering you get them free when you buy paint. I ended up clipping all the staples off the face, wiping the dust off, and reinstalling the grills with little Velcro pads so I can remove them if I need to. I figured if it's good enough for a Pioneer CS77A, why not a thruster? Now I can take them off and put them back on quickly if I need to do anything to them. If you've seen my other speaker videos, one of the main things I always try to look at is the crossover. I like to install new capacitors so they sound as good as they can for as long as they can. As I've said many times, that's a really good entry-level project for anybody who's just starting out and wants to try doing a repair job. As such, I opened these up to check the crossover caps and, well, there aren't any. The wire comes in, attaches to the woofer, then jumps up and attaches to the piezo tweeter. No crossover board, not even a capacitor soldered in line with the wires. If you're curious, that does mean that both drivers are receiving the full frequency range of the audio signal, as opposed to other speakers I've shown, where each cone gets a limited band of frequencies based on its capabilities. I have a few capacitors lying around that are leftovers from other projects, and if I ever get really bored, I might experiment with splicing them into the lines just to see what kind of changes it makes to the sound on these. Obviously, it won't improve the sound at all, but it would definitely serve to make a neat demo video. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do that. It might be kind of cool to show a bunch of different capacitance values side by side so that you can hear the differences. Just to give a full context to these bad boys, I'd like to pair them with a more appropriate machine. Anybody remember this thing, the Panasonic SGV11 from a few videos ago? It's weirdly one of my favorite things that I've shown on this channel. I don't know why, but I like this thing a lot. I grant that these aren't the original speakers that go along with it, but they're a lot closer to the original SB556s that would have come with it than anything else that I have. One other thing that I thought was amusing with these, look at the little surrounds on the speakers. I don't know if you can tell on the video, but they're shiny cardboard. They put shiny cardboard over the top of an already shiny piece of metal that can't be accessed because the grill doesn't come off, but they didn't put one on the tweeter, which also has shiny metal. Go figure. These don't have any kind of terminals on the back. That's pretty normal for speakers like this. All they have is this cool sticker. I haven't been able to find whether these were ever sold by themselves or only paired with something. I found an example of them being promoted with the Panasonic PowerTouch unit in 1980, and somebody selling them with the same unit on Facebook, though I might dispute their assessment of the sound. So, should you rush out to buy a pair of these because they're a hidden gem? I'll be blunt and say no. They're cheap, they sound cheap, and I have no intention of implying otherwise. They have zero bass. You can't even hear Peter Steele's voice. However, if you do see yourself buying untested old equipment on a regular basis and you don't want to risk your fancier speakers, sometimes grabbing a pair like this is very helpful if you find them for cheap, especially if you don't have access to any kind of test equipment. So yeah, that's the Panasonic SB380 thruster. I'm sorry about the long pause again. When I released my previous video, I was under the assumption that I had a bunch of stuff ready to go for the next video, but it turned out everything I have either needs to be repaired first, is missing and waiting for some crucial piece that's important to the video, or I'm waiting for a special guest. The thrifting gods have been real jokesters lately, so hopefully they'll decide to be merciful again and I'll have more cool stuff to show you. But until next time, you guys keep thrifting and stay metal.